One thing I'm hearing a lot Thursday. So what happened? There was a shift in voting in council elections. So let's have a look. So first of all, there was council elections, there were mayoral elections, there was Welsh and Scottish parliamentary elections, and also a by-election, all happening at once. This is under the cover of post-pandemic, again, coming out at the end of the pandemic. Obviously, the vaccines had an impact on this. We've got Keir Starmer's Leader of the Labour Party going in there with some messaging, not very much. What has actually happened in the actual electoral results? So, in England, lots of rural council seats and places that weren't in big cities or in inner city areas or built up areas, Labour lost lots of councils. They lost control of lots of councils. There was a shift of voting preference in some city areas from Labour to Green as well. So that was the main thing you saw there. In Hartlepool, this is a big by-election because it's essentially going to be a framing of the post-Corbyn Labour Party in the way that it was being able to combat Boris Johnson as a political force. The Hartlepool, which has been a British seat that's gone to the Labour Party for 50-odd years, something like that, has finally turned the Conservatives, having got more votes under Jeremy Corbyn than they did under Tony Blair, has then moved from Labour to the Conservatives now. Due to this by-election. So that's the main things here in England, as well as some mayoral elections, which were mostly won by Labour candidates, apart from it was West Midlands went to the Conservatives, and there's a West Yorkshire one coming up pretty soon. So West Yorkshire was won by Labour, which means the Labour seat in Batley and Spen is going to be another by-election coming up soon, so that's going to be worth looking out for as well. So that's the pitch that you see from England: a shifting votes in rural areas, and mostly an overall loss of quite a lot of council control from Labour over to the Conservatives and the Greens in England. Second of all, you have the Welsh Parliament elections, which were a swing to Labour, mostly from Plaid Cymru and also from UKIP as well. So they went from being in minority control into being into giving a working majority under Mark Drakeford, who was a trade unionist, which is nice. And Plaid Cymru lost seats, and the Conservatives gained seats as well. So a bit of a post-Brexit realigning of Welsh politics now that UKIP weren't as a political force to actually be reckoned with in that area, which was interesting to see how different that was from the English elections as well. And then in Scotland, you saw the SNP increase their plurality, but fall short of a majority as well as some gains for the Conservatives, and Labour pretty much staying similar to where they were previously, as the intensity for a new referendum on Scottish independence increases over time. So that's the facts of the matter. Let's have a look into what's happening. Now, one thing I'm hearing a lot of is it's been the losses in the Labour votes in England are the hot button issue topic, because what's happened is Keir Starmer's then been giving a lot of criticisms, is bitterly disappointed. It was very, very big swing in a lot of key areas from Labour to the Conservatives, both in councils and in the Hartlepool by-election. And he has said he takes full responsibility for it, and then sacked Angela Rayner as the party chair, which is a really funny way of taking responsibility. Also replacing Annalise Dodds with Rachel Reeves, big fan of, famous anti-Semite Nancy Astor, who also claimed that she wanted to crack down on people on benefits, which is a very super, super Labour pop position to have, apparently. Honestly surprised that Green gained some seats with how far the Labour Party's going, and see left-leaning Labour voters making the switch over. Yeah, that you're not surprised. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and jumping off from that, there is a big shift rightwards in Labour Party kind of outlook, not policy, because they're not produced. Keir Starmer isn't producing any policies. He's not talking about any kind of policies or any kind of vision. He's just making platitudes, standing in front of flags, photo opportunities with pints of beer. Whereas you look at someone in Wales, you look at Mark Drakeford, who has an actual message that he's sending to the people he's supposed to be representing. He has a proper ideological stance as a trade union. He's probably a social democrat as far as that's concerned. And same thing with SNP. They have a vision of what they want. I mean, it's kind of single issue topic as regards to independence, but they also pose a reasonable opposition to Tory party hegemony as far as the UK goes in terms of policy direction. Now, it's not surprising, for example, that people would want to switch from a Labour Party that basically stands for nothing to a Conservative Party who's, we have had a good vaccine rollout, and we're actually starting to reopen now. Obviously, we'll just kind of forget the 6 figures of people who have died and focus on the good bits. But, when you are the party in power and you do have the political hegemony of the media apparatus that supports you, it's very easy for that to be a message that you can get out to people pretty easily, right? That's not surprising. Although it's also a failure, not just of Labour's lack of vision, but lack of local council policy. So you look at the places, for example, where Labour have increased their majority or done well, places like Preston, Salford, Liverpool, Bristol, all these places are places where local policy has actually had some kind of regenerative effect on these communities, which obviously hasn't. A lot of the kind of red wall constituencies have been left behind not only by, central government policy, because the Tories have been in power for so long, they could just throw money away from Labour constituencies, they just take money away from it to force them to be able to want to create political change. But even then, the local Labour governments in these areas haven't been doing the kind of policies that would engender people to want to continue to vote for, like Mark Drakeford has had over in Wales, and like people like Mark Dennett and Andy Burnham have had in Manchester, Preston, Salford, etc., etc. So if you look at Preston, the kind of local policies that they're doing that has made people excited to vote for Labour candidates are things like a cooperative fund, a credit union, all these kind of things that be able to regenerate the area without, wanting to capitulate to big corporate investment, investing in local businesses and local actions and things like that, where people have a community aspect that you don't get when you just offer big sums of money for large businesses to come into your area. So these kind of policies that create local community, local regeneration, and a transformative effect on people's genuine actual interests and livelihoods within those areas, then you're going to engender people who are going to want to keep in power. This hasn't happened in these these lost red wall constituencies where there is a large aging population, and as I went through in my last video, these are the kind of people who've benefited from low house prices. They were probably previously blue collar workers in the past, so that's why these constituencies have continued to vote Labour. But obviously, as industrialisation has changed into a more into more of the post-industrial age that we've got going at the moment, these jobs have gone away. These communities have started crumbling up from around the previous industrial industries that they were built around. It's now, especially in these constituencies where the data shows that home ownership is higher amongst Conservative voting constituencies, even though they are slightly less middle class than other places would be. I'd probably kind of reject the idea of middle class as a way of being able to group people. At the end of the day, you have proletariat and bourgeoisie as far as I'm concerned, but even if we look from a kind of traditional British sense of middle class, they're not quite there. But these are all people that, as I mentioned in my last video, they all gained from this increase in home ownership, and then the younger generations that aren't living in these places, because they've all moved to cities for actual job prospects since in the post-industrial kind of world that we live in, they're now not part of those communities which have been run down, both through the lack of Labour investment, the lack of funding from centralised, the lack of funding from Westminster that's been centralised by the Conservative Party, and also the change in demographics and demographic shift in these areas. It's not surprising that they're turning more Conservative now. Although when you look at somewhere like Hartlepool, where, as Jack points out correctly, they ran a Remain candidate. They parachuted in some fusty Remain candidate into a Leave area when we still aren't fully through the throes of the ways in which Brexit has affected our political climate. It's absolute nonsense, and the fact that Keir Starmer's like an arch Remainer, right? He was always in favour of it, and he's not going to be able to create a movement to be able to want to vote for him in these areas when he's not against Brexit that they voted for. Doesn't give them any vision to want to vote for. Doesn't offer them any kind of movement forward to make their communities rich and prosperous again, because they've lost so much over the years. And why would they? And then obviously there's sort of some amount of this that can be due to the fact that it being a Conservative government, they can just essentially promise in these by-elections, they can just kind of promise money for these people ad infinitum. And even the Labour candidate admitted that they didn't have anything to offer. And I'm like, well, maybe you should have a look at the kind of socialist policies that have, or I mean, these social democratic policies, or these local regenerative policies that have been tried and tested in these more municipal areas. Maybe you would have been able to create a movement of people who would actually want to vote for you. But unfortunately, just saying we're not the Tories and we're not Jeremy Corbyn is not enough to cut it. So, where do the left go from here? Now, I know I just mentioned him, but the first thing I want to say is stop talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Just stop it. It's dead. It's gone. You can say, "Oh, Jeremy this, Jeremy that," on both sides. The right of the Labour Party can talk about long Corbyn, even though he actually won majorities in Hartlepool with over 50% of the vote. All these kind of things, right? And how it's the actual polls that said there were poor leadership was one of the main reasons why people didn't vote for Labour in Hartlepool, etc., and in local council elections too. They thought leadership was still bad. You can't just blame Corbyn forever. But what we can't do as socialists within the Labour Party, we can't just continue to cling to this Corbyn legacy, which is only toxic from an optical perspective. Like, many people don't like Jeremy Corbyn, and polls showed that too. Partially due to media misinformation. I get that. I get that a lot of this is just, smear tactics from, plutocrats in the media industry trying to protect their vast amounts of wealth by smearing someone who might take that away from them. But he doesn't have a particularly great history and was a pretty crappy leader as well. He was really good at engaging with young people, the people whose kind of policies that he was pushing were meant to move across, right? Meant to engage them in politics. But he didn't do a good job of actually leading the party, whereas John McDonnell was actually focused on creating a movement that could actually win an election. Jeremy was very much more ideological in his outlook, and this wasn't helpful as far as winning elections is concerned. And we can't just sit there and rest on our, and to continue bringing us back to this old Corbyn would have done, etc., etc., etc. We need to find policies and a movement and, local activism that's going to be able to make people want to support our policies in the future. Now, I do think we should try and depose Starmer. I don't think he's the right man for the job. I don't think he's done a good job. And I think at this point, his reputation is probably going to be tarnished for the rest of his tenure as the Labour leader. And I don't think sticking with him is the way to go, mostly because I think he's a bit of a neoliberal shell at this point. I don't think he stands for what we stand for in general, within the Labour Party membership in general. And I don't think, as we've seen from this previous election cycle, I don't think he's going to be the person who's going to be able to bring people across who've been lost to the Conservatives now in red wall seats either. I don't think he's the worst of both worlds at this point, really. We need to think more local about the ways in which we engage with people in these constituencies. A lot of people have been talking about a cultural rift that's happened in the country. And if I have to read the word metropolitan on Twitter any more times, I think I'm going to scream. We have this, Khalid Mahmood was talking about how, wealthy, city-dwelling, liberal, metropolitan, all these kind of buzzwords about young people within inner cities who are somehow supposed to be less working class than somebody who actually owns their house in these red wall constituencies, right? Like, if we're struggling to pay the bills, we're living paycheck to paycheck, and we're having 40% of our income extracted from us in the form of rent because we're never going to be part of the property owning portion of this country. For generations, right? For decades and decades, we're going to be completely excluded from the property market. Again, as I explained in my last video, you want to go and watch that to be able to get a rough idea of what I'm talking about here. But just to be clear, what has happened over time is that property has been more and more collected within the hands of a few amount of people and an older amount of people, and first-time buyers are getting older and older as well, which means more and more young people are being excluded from home ownership due to the cuts in social housing and the continued low interest rates. That means and obviously the stamp duty holiday we just had means that more people who have current accumulated wealth are then investing that in more property, which then reduces the supply, increases the demand, price goes up, etc. You get that, which prices young people out of property ownership. So you have people who have vast amounts of asset wealth, much more than we do at our generation, who still come from, the DE economic class that we do. They're still working, they were working or are in the ends of their working career in kind of low-skilled jobs. The kind of things that a lot of millennials work in. I work in a bloody call center, right? Maybe I'm educated as a person, but it doesn't mean that's not a level of class, right? You can be educated and you can still be poor. Young people, our generation has the biggest university attendance of any generation in British history, right? More and more of us are going into education. Now, what this leads to is educational inflation. The more people who have degrees, the less your degree is worth, because it doesn't set you apart from the rest of your of the rest of these people as well, right? Whereas previously, very few people went to university, especially not from working class backgrounds either. These people, there was this cultural rift between the two of them. And you've got the degree, you went into these higher paid skilled jobs, and if you didn't, then you went into either there was definitely skilled jobs for you to go to, like plenty of vocational tradesmanship jobs are very, very skilled and actually reasonably well paid as well. But you don't need a university education, you need an apprenticeship, etc., etc. Like, there's, going back to the point I was making, there's the education inflation thing that I'm going on, which means that despite the fact that our generation is really highly educated as far as generations go, we're all still working in the kind of DE sector. Like, how is someone who is 62 in Bolton and who owns their own, 6-figure home that was worth £20,000 when they bought it in the 70s, like, how is this person supposed to be more of a working class person than someone who maybe got a degree but then ends up working in H&M in retail or in a coffee shop or in a call centre, who doesn't own any property at all, has basically zero assets as well? These are being labelled as the metropolitan liberal elite. I'm like, well, no, we're just working class. We just have a different life kind of trajectory, and we're talking about what's happened is people are talking about class as some kind of nebulous cultural identity, rather than a material quantitative description of the conditions that you live in and the job that you do and the work that you do and your relationship to the means of production. Now, I'm going to sound like a scary Marxist here, but that's what working class is. If you make your money from the labour that you sell to a capitalist, and you don't make money off capital gains, you don't make money off of other people's labour, you are working class. That is how that works. You don't have to wear a football shirt and a flat cap. They may be cultural trappings that are sometimes, codependent on being, or codependent, sorry, are kind of correlated with the working class background. These are just cultural trappings. These are not an actual definition of what constitutes, from a quantitative sense, being someone who is working class. What this is a long-term optical mission from the right to decouple the material reality of working class and to cloud this in the kind of cultural trappings that I mentioned before, trying to drive a electoral wedge between the city-dwelling working class, or the younger working class, or the educated working class, and the older rural-dwelling working class as well. Because at the end of the day, our interests, apart from with regards to our property wealth, which, as I've mentioned before, like, the only way of solving the property disparity is with, building of social housing, of additional housing development to be able to increase the supply, so that the demand supply curve means the price goes down. But that's going to affect the material interests of the electoral cohort that's very large, you don't want to see their house prices drop, which is what's going to happen if you build more social housing. So it makes it basically kind of like, it makes it, very, very, it's like political poison to want to advocate for additional housing building. Like, the amount of letters people in planning permission get whenever someone tries to build any amount of additional housing in any area. I've seen this firsthand plenty of times, but I'm sure it's not just anecdotal evidence on my half. I think this holds true as far as most areas of the country go. The planning permissions, it's electoral suicide to want to be at the point at which you're going to be trying to reduce people's assets that they hold at the moment by decreasing their property wealth. But regardless, the material conditions that we are in, the material interests that we as working class people have now, whether you be working as, whether you're working as a tradesman, or whether you're working in the service industry, or whether you're working in a call centre, or wherever you are, if you are selling your labour to a capitalist, our interests as working people, at the very least, are the same. And if you ignore these kind of cultural trappings that are meant to divide these, to be able to pit the municipal working class people against rural working class people, then that's an easy way of creating an electoral paradigm that, especially within first past the post, that creates division to be able to engender conservative power. And what we have to do as leftists is we have to find a way to bridge that gap and to decouple the propaganda that's been driving this wedge. Because you see a lot on the internet, people talking about, oh, it's just the left's become too woke. It's all woke liberals sipping lattes, and I'm just like, I don't give a shit what coffee. Old people drink coffee too. Like, have you ever been to a branch of Costa Coffee? There's people of every generation in there drinking coffee. Just because we're younger and we're hip and we've grown up around a paradigm in which there are other people of different cultures that we grow up around. Just because we have this different outlook doesn't mean we're any less working class. Doesn't mean we're any less part of this movement in which we need to create better conditions for working people. Like, you don't own a bunch of assets that set us apart materially from these people. Like, it's a ridiculous fallacy that has been born out of conservative propaganda. We have to break that down. I think the way we do that is through, as I mentioned before, local policy, regenerative policy that shows that from a local government kind of lens, it shows that we can benefit people with these policies. We can benefit both young and old, whether they be young working class or old working class people, like working class people alike, they can still be beneficiaries of these policies. Because at the end of the day, people say, oh, Labour have lost the working class. Well, what does the working class need? They need high wages, they need more working benefits, they need better control over their workplace. These are all things that working people just need, right? From quantitative perspective, quantitative perspective, right? They need not to go through fire and rehire. Which is the party that is standing against fire and rehire? It's the Labour Party, right? Which is the one that's fighting for a higher minimum wage? It's the Labour Party. Like, these are not conservative issues. Just because you dislike the fact that Labour have some kind of social issues they take care of as well, you cannot ignore the material importance of the actual policies that have been generally supported by labour movements throughout history. Throughout history. And just because, screw you, I've got my house, I've got my retirement, doesn't mean that you shouldn't at least try and take some responsibility to create a better world for the person that you used to be, right? I'm not trying to, I guess I'm kind of preaching to these people here, and it's like, look, I understand where your material interests lie, but as someone who is working, as these old people are working class people who went through their entire lives going in these industries. Like, imagine if you were going through fire and rehire right now. Imagine how much that would actually affect you, and the pay cut that you'd have, and the worst working conditions and the worst benefits that you would be forced to take through corporate hegemony. And the only way of breaking corporate hegemony is with a Labour government. It's the only way of doing it. I mean, or another political left-wing party's Labour government, but that's not happening. I don't live in a fantasy world where suddenly the Liberal Democrats or the Greens or or Tusk or whatever can suddenly win an election. At the moment, we live in a two-party system until first past the post goes, which fingers crossed it hopefully will do, which is not going to, because the Conservatives are basically trying to build power forever, as we'll talk about later, trying to fight on the grounds that the battlegrounds that have been drawn by the Conservatives about this culture war nonsense and what defines working class. We need to fight that worldview with a positive worldview of our own to be able to change the paradigm that we live in. Otherwise, if we keep fighting on the battlefields that they've drawn up, they're going to keep winning. Maybe, and also I think there's a reasonable amount of argument that we stop being so vitriolic in our social policy and our social policy advocacy, because that does piss people off, and people don't like. I don't want to call it woke stuff, because that's a really loaded phrase that pisses off a lot of people. And I think it does disservice to the social policy that we have. But just because we advocate for the rights of ethnic minorities, the rights of LGBTQ people, these social issues, doesn't mean that we also that doesn't mean that we're not also fighting for the needs of, the material needs of working people as well. And that is the position that we need to get across to people. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the manifesto, especially under Corbyn and things like that, there were loads of good things for working people there. Obviously there were, but no one heard about it because we spent too much time fighting on this culture war bollocks that gets pushed by the media, it gets pushed by the Conservative Party, and it gets pushed by people who have an axe to grind. Because at the end of the day, it's not as big an issue as what's happening with regards to the public money and tax avoidance and all these crony contracts and employment laws. Like post-Brexit, the Conservatives were looking at scrapping the Working Time Directive, which is clearly going to massively impact. Who is it going to impact? Of course it's going to impact working class people, right? Like, these are all issues that we agree on, so we need to find a way in which we actually agree on these issues moving forward, rather than letting the cultural issues be driven by the people who we don't represent, the people who don't represent us, essentially. And hello, Reese, how are you doing? You keeping well? I hope you are. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a rant there, because I just get frustrated at being told that I'm somehow part of the elite just because I happen to have gone to university, right? Like, that's not where the elitism line is drawn anymore. I get elite. What is an elite and who's the establishment? It's been such a fucking muddied term at this point. It's impossible to have a reasonable conversation about it, because then it's like, oh, you're an elitist, you went to university. Oh, you're part of the establishment because you support LGBTQ people. I'm just like, corporations cynically push these issues because they think it's going to engender them more money. They don't seriously believe in these particular political movements. Like, you're the one being the idiot, taking a corporation at its word. If you seriously think that Wagamama slapping an LGBTQ flag on the front of their shopfront is in some way indicative of the political beliefs of the people in charge, rather than just some kind of cynical marketing ploy. Like, on the left, we call that rainbow capitalism, right? We dislike that. No, everyone hates that. But we need to get those messages across, because otherwise we're just going to get lost in a sea of cultural nonsense that's fucking meaningless, and all it does is just divide the people who have a genuine class interest together. Rant over for now, I guess.